What's up everyone and welcome. In this episode we're going to talk about a newly discovered Windows bootkit. We'll go through and review the story and see what we can do to thwart this rare but extremely dangerous type of attack, so stick around to the end.
Oh, drat these computers. They're so naughty and so complex. I could pinch them.
A rare Windows UEFI bootkit malware has been discovered, offering attackers a path to cyber-espionage, researchers are warning. According to ESET, the bootkit's goal is to install a full-featured backdoor on a target PC, which supports a rich set of commands and contains various automatic data exfiltration capabilities, including document stealing, keylogging, and monitoring of the victim's screen by periodically taking screenshots. The UEFI, or Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, is the embedded firmware component in computing chips responsible for securing the computing environment upon startup and loading the operating system. As such, it's an ideal place to plant malware to ensure its persistence, since UEFI loads no matter what changes or restarts the operating system goes through. The new malicious bootkit, which researchers at ESET have named e-spectre, camps out on the EFI system partition portion of the embedded technology. The ESP contains the bootloaders or kernel images that UEFI uses to start installed operating systems and various utilities at boot time. Attackers thus achieve execution in the early stages of the system boot process before the operating system is fully loaded, according to ESET's eSpectre analysis issued Tuesday. This allows eSpectre to bypass Windows Driver Signature Enforcement, or DSE, in order to execute its own unsigned driver at system. That driver then injects other user mode components into specific system processes, researchers noted, and those in turn are used to hook up with a command and control server. After that connection is made between the system and the command and control server, attackers can commence downloading and running additional malware or executing various commands to take full control of the machine.
By Astrobo to here, here, and here. Then by space navigal compass to here, here, and then to here, and here. By 13-point stratocumulus bearing 4 million light years, and thus to our destination.
Interestingly, ESET's technical analysis of eSpectre shows that its beginnings stretch back to 2012 and using master boot record modification as its persistence method, but development has been fairly dormant from 2012 until recently. Since then, there have only been insignificant changes to the code, researchers said, until last year. That's when its operators moved the malware from targeting legacy BIOS systems to modern UEFI systems. Researchers aren't sure yet how it's distributed, but once eSpectre finds its way onto the PC, it begins its UEFI infection by modifying a legitimate Windows boot manager binary, and this binary, bootmgfw.efi, is located on the ESP, according to ESET. In order to successfully drop its malicious payload, eSpectre needs to modify the boot manager in order to bypass integrity checks that prevent execution of rogue bootkit elements, researchers noted. The boot manager is responsible for finding an installed operating system within the ESP and transferring the execution task for that OS to a kernel loader. That OS kernel loader then loads and executes the next component in the boot chain, the Windows kernel itself, which contains the linchpin DSE security check mentioned earlier. To get around the integrity checks and establish persistence during the startup process, eSpectre looks for byte patterns that identify various verification processes, and then it simply patches them. For instance, eSpectre searches memory for BMFW verify self-integrity using various byte patterns, and modifies this function in a way that it always returns 0, indicating that verification was successful, researchers explain.
What'd I do?
eSpectre also inserts a detour for the function responsible for the aforementioned transferring of execution to the OS kernel that allows it to patch the Windows kernel in memory once it is loaded, but before it is executed, according to the write-up. The final stage of the bootkit's boot code is responsible for disabling DSE by patching the SEP initialized code integrity kernel function. Then it can seamlessly execute the driver that starts the rest of the ESPecter process. According to ESET, the driver's main purpose is to load two different user mode payloads, there's winsys.dll and client.dll, and to set up a keylogger that intercepts all keyboard activity. After that, it deletes itself. The winsys.dll payload periodically pings the command and control server. It finds its address in the malware's configuration file. It pings the command and control server to download additional malware or carry out simple commands. The command and control server can ask it to upload system information like CPU name, OS version, memory size, Ethernet MAC address, the list of all installed software, and so on. It can fetch and execute new files, it can restart the PC, or it can download a new configuration. Client.dll is the more fully featured payload. It acts as a richly featured backdoor, according to ESET. It sets up its own encrypted communication channel with the command and control server, after which it waits for commands. Those commands include stop the backdoor, execute command line received from command and control server and capture output using pipes, execute power commands like log off, power off, reboot, or shut down, take screenshots of foreground window, full screenshot, or it could change automatic screenshotting parameters depending on the value of the parameter, execute various file system operations, upload collected data and files, execute various service-related commands, execute various process-related commands, modify configuration values, and start and stop the keylogger. ESET researchers said that they don't know how ESPectre is specifically distributed, but for initial compromise, it's likely that it takes advantage of one of the various UEFI firmware vulnerabilities that allow disabling or bypassing secure boot. Secure boot is a security standard for PCs using UEFI that ensures that devices boot using only trusted software. For most computers, it's the main barrier to compromise at the startup layer, and it must be disabled in order to successfully boot with a modified boot manager, ESET researchers noted. Though secure boot stands in the way of executing untrusted UEFI binaries from the ESP, over the last few years, this is ESET talking, we have been witness to various ways around it, according to the analysis. This shows that securing UEFI firmware is a challenging task, and that the way various vendors apply security policies and use UEFI services is not always ideal. I guess there's really no standard for all of these vendors to follow to ensure they use security first principles. Now, other than exploiting a vulnerability, other possible scenarios for getting around secure boot included the following, according to the analysis. The attacker has physical access to the device, historically known as an evil maid attack, and manually disables secure boot in the BIOS setup menu. It is common for the firmware configuration menu to still be labeled and referred to as the BIOS setup menu, even on UEFI systems, ESET pointed out. Secure boot was already disabled on the compromised machine. For example, the user might dual boot Windows and other operating systems that do not support secure boot. The first Windows version supporting secure boot was Windows 8, so machines running all previous versions are vulnerable to the attack. Thus, keeping PCs up to date and correctly configured can help thwart an ESPectre attack. Malicious bootkits are rare to find in the wild, ESET noted, with only 3 real-world cases of UEFI malware having been discovered prior to ESPectre. The first was LoJax, discovered by ESET in 2018, and believed to have been used by the Russian advanced persistent threat known as apt28, or aka Fancy Bear or Sophacy. LoJax is a modified version of Absolute Software's LoJack recovery software for laptops. LoJack hides on a system's UEFI and stealthily beacons its whereabouts back to the owner for possible physical recovery of the laptop. Unfortunately, a vulnerable 2009 version had several key bugs, chief among them a configuration module that was poorly secured with weak encryption, which the bad guys took advantage of in order to weaponize it. Then there was Mosaic Regressor, discovered by Kaspersky in 2019. It was spotted in the wild, targeting diplomats and members of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, from Africa, Asia, and Europe via email. All the targets had ties to North Korea. Mosaic Regressor is based on a customized version of the leaked source code of Hacking Team's Vector EDK bootkit, according to an analysis at the time. The third is a new version of the FinSpy surveillance kit uncovered by Kaspersky last week, which was a module that also compromises the Windows UEFI boot manager. Even though fully fledged bootkits are few and far between, in the last few years, we have seen proof of concept examples of UEFI bootkits like Dream Boot or EFI Guard, leaked documents for Dare Stark and Quark Matter, and even leaked source code hacking Team Vector EDK, according to ESET researchers. They added that more bootkits are sure to emerge. It's no surprise that such a widespread technology as UEFI has also become a tempting target for threat actors in their search for ultimate persistence, they said. So, what do we learn? Well, besides the fact that this is a nasty little piece of malware that can attain persistence and evade normal operating system security policies, since it's loaded during the boot process, there is currently no definitive information about how this is being spread outside of the of ESET's note about if the UEFI already has a vulnerability, maybe taking advantage of it, or the other possibilities mentioned within the article about it being turned off by a malicious made or person, it being turned off by the user because they have a dual boot system and one of the operating systems doesn't support it, etc. So if you recall in our previous episodes where we had discussed bootloaders, we noted that common ways for bootloaders to spread are potentially through malicious update requests, or like phishing campaigns. For example, an attacker pushes a message to you claiming to be a legitimate upgrade for either software or firmware on your system, and when you install that, it basically switches the security off and then injects payload. Or like I said, as mentioned in the article, unpatched systems that may already have a vulnerability in the UEFI where it's just implement the payload there. You don't necessarily need to turn it off because the UEFI already has the vulnerability. Or it could be distributed through a supply chain attack where somewhere along the line between the firmware provider and you're installing the software patch, a legitimate binary from the firmware or the chip provider is infected with the malware, and then when they send out the real upgrade notification, it's already part of the legitimate firmware software. So how do we stay safe from this kind of attack? In the case of the supply chain attack, most individuals will probably not be checking the changes or signatures or checksums of the firmware before installing, but that is one way to reduce the possibility of being affected via a supply chain attack. Now, if you recall my episode on the Code Cove supply chain attack, that is exactly how it was found. A customer downloaded an update, did a checksum, verified between the checksum that he calculated on the downloaded file versus what the company was providing, saw that there was a discrepancy, informed the company, and then poof, they realized that they were the victim of a supply chain attack. Now, in the case of, say, phishing attacks, it's important to be aware of principles to check and protect yourself against phishing attacks. I recommend, of course, watching my episode on phishing attacks to learn what you can do to spot a phishing attack. Things like, checking the domain or bookmarking important websites and only visiting those websites via the bookmark, those kinds of things. The link, of course, is going to be here above, as well as pinned in the comment section below and within the videos at the end of this episode. Now, additionally, as the article recommends, keep your devices and software patched and up to date. With that, I say thanks again for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe if you haven't already, and smash the bell if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.